Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome. I'm Judy Farvolden, Executive Director of Mobility Network. And before introducing this session, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event sponsored by Mobility Network at the School of Cities. Mobility Network is an institutional strategic initiative. There we are. At the University of Toronto. U of T's institutional strategic initiatives address humanity's greatest challenges. Grand challenges demand a cross-disciplinary and collaborative approach between university researchers and their partners in government, industry, and the public. In Mobility Network's case, our starting point is a recognition that the sustainable, equitable, and efficient movement of people and goods is a regional, national, and global challenge. Our mission is to harness the incredible depth and breadth of U of T's researchers to induce transformational changes in mobility services, usage, and impacts to effect significant positive societal change. We believe that U of T has a primary role to play in first, understanding the complexity of the systemic and cross-cutting mobility challenges facing us, and then translating this understanding into positive and innovative change.
Welcome everyone, and as Judy suggests, this is one of those panel discussions, and as a part of this series, the way moving forward. My name is Hugh Liu. I'm a professor at the Institute for Aerospace Studies, and also serving as a director of the Center for Aerial Robotics Research and Education. So my research is really in this intelligent unmanned aerial system research, also known as drones, which we have in the past used for real-time traffic management, working through my colleagues from U-Tree as well as with the City of Toronto, among other things. So with this background, it gives me a great pleasure to be the moderator for today's panel discussion, mainly as a listener for this topic. Today's discussion topic is negotiating with robots in the public realm. Our panels are going to talk about opportunities and the challenges they see with the movement to introduce the robots to our public in the public domain, and what's happening, and also they're going to talk about the other issues that are associated with that. So we have 3 U of T expert researchers in this relevant domain to share with us their viewpoints, to trigger some conversations and the deep thoughts in this space. I'm really looking forward to it. So my role will be, I will introduce each of the speaker in sequence. And each of the speakers will have a chance to talk about their viewpoints. And we will, in the meantime, we welcome everyone in the audience that if you do have any questions, and please to send your questions through the chat box as a moderator, as well as the technical support behind me, Pat, and we'll be looking at those the questions. And at the end of our panel discussions, we will have an opportunity to raise those questions and for the panel members to address them. And in the meantime, I will assume that everyone that just to maintain this Zoom environment healthy and focused, and just turn off your the micro. I think that except for the panel the speakers. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. And for our first speaker is Dr. Shauna Brail. She's an associate professor at the Institute for Management and Innovation, U of T Mississauga. She's also as an economic geographer and urban planner. Her research focus is on the transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. And you may hear some of her recent activities, especially working with Transport Canada. I think it's going to be very relevant to today's topic. And Dr. Brail is also a senior associate at the Innovation Policy Lab in the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, as well as a faculty affiliate with the U of T Transportation Research Institute. So Shauna, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to join today's panel and discussion to the Mobility Network. And thank you, Hugh, for that introduction. As you said, my background is as an economic geographer and an urban planner, and my interest in robots is from both a policy perspective and a concern for what their application could mean for the use of public space, infrastructure, and resources in cities. And I come to the subject of robots from work that I've been doing on the emergence of disruptive mobility technologies in cities, such as ride-hailing, since about 2015. And as Hugh mentioned, last year I wrote a report along with my colleague, Professor Betsy Donald from Queen's University, on the state of autonomous cargo delivery technology, including both robots and drones, and the prospects for their future uses with a focus on the Canadian context. And this work was done for Transport Canada. Today, I'm going to center my remarks on what we learned while writing that report and what it means for how we consider the role of robots in the public realm. I want to start by acknowledging that the subject of robots is contentious. It can generate intense debate and also much needed discussion of a wide variety of perspectives. And we really do need to hear all of these perspectives in order to understand the opportunities and the challenges that robotic technology presents. The other thing I would say is, in terms of the title of the panel, I would actually add a question mark after negotiating with robots in the public realm. Should we be negotiating with them? How do we negotiate with them? What is their role? What is society's role? There are three key issues that I'm going to sort of go through in the rest of my remarks. They're not exhaustive. The first one is around overarching challenges and opportunities that robotic technologies present in terms of sort of public engagement, which particularly means that they are being used as delivery robots and sometimes as service robots. Also with respect to the kinds of firms that operate in this space and the policy environment. And I'll start with the challenges and opportunities. There are a wide range of benefits that robots really can bring to society and to cities. And three benefits in particular are contactless delivery, benefits around equity, and the potential for reduced costs. In terms of contactless delivery, robots offer the potential to deliver goods without human contact, which, as we know, demand accelerated for contactless delivery during COVID-19 with the rise of sort of the public health risk of transmission. Robot delivery during this time was rolled out, for instance, at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore, where robots were being used to deliver food to students on a campus, in a campus environment. Starship, which is the largest robot delivery firm, saw its delivery volume increase something like 3 to 4 times at the start of the pandemic. And so demand for delivery has increased, but so too has demand for contactless delivery, which is something that robots actually can present us with in a sort of important, significant way. The second is the equity piece. And this goes both ways when we're looking at the issue of robots, but I'm going to talk about equity as a benefit, as an opportunity. Autonomous robots provide another delivery option for people who, for whatever reason, can't, don't, or won't be able to go and pick up their goods on their own. In Japanese cities, for instance, which are both aging and experiencing labor shortages, delivery robots are being tested as a way of circumventing the challenge of a lack of labor and mobility challenges for an aging population. Thirdly, reduced costs. And at some level, this one is the most hypothetical because it requires scaling of activity in order to achieve a sort of a lower cost of delivery. And it can be both lower labor costs, again, a double-edged sword, because while on the one hand we might be saving on labor costs, we aren't certain what the impact on employment could be. And secondly, lower energy costs. So thinking about if the alternative to having something delivered by an autonomous robot is having it delivered by a vehicle, then we're looking at reduced emissions. If we're comparing robots to bicycles, it's a different story. The profit margins for delivery in general are estimated to be something like in the 2 to 5% range, which is in part why firms are so interested in trying to engage in this delivery space with something that has the potential to save very large sums of money. The cost savings accrue most actually when labor costs are relatively high, and lower labor costs can translate though into fewer jobs. Challenges, I think many people are very familiar with these challenges. The most significant one is the question of whether or not robots make public spaces less safe or less accessible for others already using them. Are our sidewalks wide enough? Are our curb cuts the right sort of width and technical specifications to permit a robot to operate on them? We'll talk about sidewalk safety, especially concerns for those using mobility devices, including wheelchairs, walkers, strollers, and people with vision and hearing impairments. The speed of the robot and the weight of the robots is another very significant issue when we think about safety and whether robots make public spaces less safe. There are legal and other questions around who and which vehicles have a right to use the sidewalk. And thirdly, there are ethical issues and issues around surveillance, data collection, physical intrusiveness, the use of cameras on robots. Who owns the data and the images that these robots are collecting, and how is this data used? A second important piece is around what are firms doing that are operating in this space. And we have both large firms like Amazon, UPS, FedEx, but we also have homegrown firms in Canada and in other countries as well. Absent government policy and regulations, just like in other areas of disruptive mobility, firms continue to experiment. You may be familiar with Tiny Mile, which I wanted to point out was located at an incubator at what is, as of today, Toronto Metropolitan University, and actually was operating absent regulations. Another company in Calgary called Dianomix is operating grocery delivery robots. And rather than operate absent regulations, they actually went to both the province and the city and ensured that there was a regulatory framework already in place so that they could operate legally, giving them both the confidence to attract investment and the confidence to know that they could remain there while they had approval. So we have these two different ways that firms can operate and really affects the way in which we have both the confidence, but also in terms of understanding what is the potential for rolling out robots and for managing how these robots are operating, which really means we need to have government engagement and involvement. Absent government policy and regulations, firms are becoming very strong advocates for the policies that they want to see implemented. In 2020, Amazon and FedEx backed bills in a dozen US states where at least 6 succeeded. One of the arguments for why government needs to engage here actively is because we actually should be writing regulations that we want as a society and not having firms come to us with these regulations. Thirdly, again, and connected on the government policy side, the regulatory environment is complex and it comes with challenges. So doing nothing, choosing not to act, that's a policy choice. In the Canadian context, it's largely the municipal and provincial governments that regulate. Municipalities are responsible for operations on sidewalks, vehicle licensing, creating some of the testing and pilot opportunities, but the provinces define what constitutes a vehicle and what's permitted to be on and cross the street. So this requires tremendous coordination and collaboration. There's a role for the federal government too, to promote best practices, to fund the development of technology, to provide opportunities for knowledge sharing and learning, and perhaps even to provide opportunities for testing using procurement programs. So I'll close. I have more to say, but I will close to move on. Going back to my background as a geographer and an urban planner, I'll end my remarks with the comment that when considering robots in the public realm, place really matters. And it matters for the types of places in which we might consider testing robots, whether what kind of urban form we're looking at, suburb, downtown core, campuses, and in terms of how we determine priorities. Are we looking for cost savings, emission savings? Are we looking to protect public space for existing uses? And are we looking to put an emphasis on supporting innovation? And so all of these things need to come into play and think about what should we do when we're thinking about and asking the question, how should robots be able to negotiate in the public realm? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And Shauna, that I think this is a really great starting that you cover the challenges, opportunity, but also you address legal, ethical, policy, different aspects. So that's great. So next, I would like to bring our bring Matt. But before I introduce, I just want to have a quick reminder to our audience. If you have any question to any of the speakers, I'll encourage you to write your questions from the chat box and wait until we have all the speakers have an opportunity to share with us the viewpoint, and then we'll bring back those questions and for general discussions. So our next speaker, our panelist, is Matt Roorda. He's a fellow professor in engineering faculty. He's a professor in the Department of Civil and Minor Engineering. He's also a Canada Research Chair in Freight Transportation and Logistics. So his research covers the urban goods movement to help private sectors carry development more efficient and sustainable logistical solutions. So I'm sure that Shauna talk about this service and the delivery, and love to hear Matt's viewpoints to maybe elaborate further on that front. So Matt, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Hugh. Well, first of all, thanks to Shauna for giving a great intro and stole a lot of my remarks, and not stole, but I actually have a lot of agreement with what Shauna put forth, and I actually had a chance to read the report that she did for Transport Canada, which was really excellent and a great resource. Let me just first of all say what my current involvement in the sort of the domain of sidewalk robots. I've done some work in the logistics side of it, optimization of their operations, dabbled a little bit in this field, but most, I think, interesting maybe is the recent laboratory experiments that we've been doing. We've been working with a private sector partner in the courier industry and helping them investigate new technologies, new ways of operating, including things like cargo tricycles, combined mobile distribution centers, and so on. And sidewalk robots are one of their initiatives, and I'm trying to help them out with investigating what are the benefits, challenges that they might experience, and so on. So I also want to point out, I noticed Roe-Wei Lee is in the audience, and she's the master's student that has been working in this laboratory with what we call a follow me robot. It's a piece of technology that, it accompanies a courier. It follows them without a handle. So it's like pulling a wagon with no handle. And, there's a lot of, interesting reasons why this might be a useful technology. But yeah, so my research focuses largely on finding alternatives to the status quo being truck deliveries primarily. In medium size, sometimes heavy duty vehicles, sometimes cars, and looking at new technologies in the context of what they're replacing as well. So there are certainly challenges and disbenefits of having trucks on our roads in downtown areas or where there's pedestrians and cyclists. There's safety issues with trucks, emissions from the diesel powered engines or the gasoline powered engines, depending on what type of truck it is. And so, we try to evaluate the performance and some of the side effects of technologies in the context of what the alternatives are. And so that's kind of the approach I take. It's trying to look at where the benefits are best for different types of technologies, right sizing the technology for the different contexts, as Shauna pointed out. So in detail, what we're doing in our lab, I don't have a lot of lab experience. This is my first time working in a lab with technology, but we're seeing how these robots perform in the context of obstacles, in the context of people walking nearby them, and trying to assess, when do they stop, when do they slow down, kind of reverse engineering one example piece of technology and trying to see exactly how it operates. And after we do this in the lab setting, the next step that we try to do is simulate. So and enter that behavior into a computer simulation so that we can test all sorts of other scenarios in a perfectly safe environment on a computer, but see what happens when you introduce a robot into a crowded pedestrian environment or into a corridor or into a narrow sidewalk, and look at what the behavior will be, what its behavior is. Does it just stop when it gets crowded, or does it block the way for pedestrians and cause congestion and so on? So I kind of like this idea of doing things in a risk-free environment before introducing it in sort of low-risk real-life settings. And I think that would be the next step. If things look good in a simulation, that's when you move to the next step, which is kind of a pilot in a relatively controlled real-life environment. And then if that works, then you roll it out. So that's the progression that I see as appropriate when it comes to new technologies when there's people at play. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of rationale. I had some remarks about the rationale for robot deliveries and some of the technical hurdles, but I know that Shauna has already introduced some of these, but I guess for me, it's important to look at what the alternatives are. There's a lot of impacts of trucks in congested urban areas. They cause congestion, they cause emissions, they cause air quality pollutants that are also health impacts for people. And they cause conflicts with pedestrians and cyclists. So the degree to which a much lighter weight sidewalk robot might be an improvement, that's what I think it's important to look at the opportunities and investigate them. Is it cost effective? Well, this is, again, probably not at the beginning in the experimental phase, but as rollout goes forward, then I think it can be. In my experience, there are opportunities for making it cheaper for the deliveries themselves. And I think there's one other element that Shauna didn't mention that I'd like to, and that is about the health and safety impacts for the couriers. Couriers, currently, I've walked along with couriers that are pulling the large carts, and there's significant health and safety impacts for the courier themselves. And so looking at ways to, facilitate their job is another benefit of robots. Of course, there's all the technological hurdles that have to be overcome. The obvious ones, like what happens when there's a delivery but nobody's home. What happens with stairs? I know there's some technologies that allow vehicles to climb stairs. But then the obvious are the interactions with pedestrians, and especially the blind, the elderly, those in wheelchairs, and I've seen lots of examples in the news about situations where wheelchair ramps are blocked by some of these delivery robots, or the ramp that is the curb cut is blocked by a robot, which prevents people maybe in a wheelchair who can't step up the curb, who have trouble getting off the road in time. So these are the kinds of situations we really have to grapple with before, I think, any full-scale rollout. And then the other question I have is, what happens when there's a lot of them? And that causes a whole new set of problems. Congestion, robot congestion on our sidewalks, I don't think we want to see that. So again, I agree with Shauna that context is very important. Looking at maybe lanes for robots in cases where that makes sense, requiring that they go in back alleys where that makes sense. But there are some situations where it's actually not a bad solution. I'll end my remarks there.
Thank you, Matt. And I think that especially that you're talking about technological hurdles and the challenges. I think we have already heard this safety that from both of you, Shauna and Matt. If Matt, you're focused on this, looking at the safety from the robot's point of view, how do we address this? But we perhaps that we should look from the other side, it is from a human, the societal impact. So with that, I would like to introduce our third speaker, and Professor Ron Buliung is a professor in the Department of Geography, Geomatics and the Environment at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and he currently also serves as a graduate chair of U of T's tri-campus graduate programs in geography and planning. According to his bio, his early research focused on this journey to school and how school travel connects with and impacts the childhood health. But he's in the last decade, he's really focused on that on the various ways in which disability ableism are produced by and embedded within the institutions that govern the making the places within cities where we live, where we work, play, and learn. So with that, love to hear from Ron's perspective when we talk about the robots. Ron, the screen is yours.
Very much, Hugh. Every time I hear that I'm talking about robots, I chuckle because I really can't believe that we're actually here having this conversation. It's sort of inevitable. So I was thinking, writing down notes, listening to my colleagues, and I'm very grateful to both of them for their work and contributions to this discussion. And I have the luxury of going last, so I get to sort of respond in a way to some of the things that I've heard. First of all, it's very clear to me that reading widely on the subject since I was asked to participate, that there's very much a need for this kind of conversation to occur. Like, I shared with my friends here that I was the last of my friends to get a bank card. I'm a bit of an iconoclast. I don't actually want to see the robots running around the city doing this kind of thing. And that being said, this is going to happen. So we need to figure out how to make it happen in a way that makes sense. I sort of come to this work from a disability studies and planning perspective. And I have several concerns. I'm the parent of somebody who uses a power wheelchair to travel around the city. Had I thought to bring slides today, I would have shown you a photo of my daughter trying to get around a recycling bin. So we haven't even figured out how to make garbage day a less ableist process, let alone introducing robots into the city. From a sort of, in some ways, I guess I feel my role here today is to provoke. And so I started reflecting on sort of ethical robotics, or the ethics of robots, and so on and so forth. To that end, I needed to remind myself that we're talking here about the use of robots in a particular application, in a particular setting. Right. And so there are other contexts within which, medical, therapeutic, and other contexts where we already have robotic technology doing some fairly interesting things. So I started asking some questions like, what does a robot do? What can it do? What will it look like? And what capabilities would it have? For example, if designed from the start with disability in mind. I was reminded here, of course, Shauna mentioned equity and delivery. Matt mentioned climbing stairs. And it occurred to me, like, we haven't even figured out how to make buildings accessible for people. And so are we going to allow our conversation about robots and the delivery of goods to shape that conversation. That's something that hadn't even occurred to me. So I find that to be like a fascinating moment in this discussion, and troubling at the same time, I think. So in terms of the equity piece, one thing that occurred to me is, like, we're thinking about delivery from point A to point B, and the person at point B can interact with that robot with all of the possibilities of what a so-called able-bodied body can do. So what fascinates me, as well as thinking about the sort of human-machine interface, I spent some time actually doing a little sketch planning design exercise with my daughter with one of these following robots. And said, okay, well, that's going to work for you. What does it need to do? Well, certainly a lot more than what it currently does. For example, it needs to elevate. It needs to do a whole pile of other things that it currently doesn't do. And it also needs to be a little bit less expensive. I suppose in terms of cost savings, I started thinking, like, who's paying, so we're saving money, but on whose labor, right? So this for me sort of connected with thinking through ethical production of robotic technology. What does that look like, right? We know that, for example, this type of technology, electric vehicles and so on and so forth, rely on lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion battery technology makes use of cobalt, and 70% of global cobalt reserves are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there's and 15 to 30% of those reserves are pulled out of the ground through artisanal mining operations, which can be problematic from a human rights perspective. In fact, the act of getting the cobalt to power the robots can be a disabling exercise in and of itself. So the impacts of this technology are not just reserved for the local context. We can trace the effects into the global supply chain and beyond. And of course, I'm not an expert in artisanal mining, but I do know, for example, that it's naive to call for an end to artisanal mining, because the critical importance of that type of activity in some economies. Yes, so a couple of other things that came to mind. I like Matt's thoughtfulness around thinking about alternatives, and I think we have to carefully wade into that territory and think about who the winners and losers would be in that context. Think about, like, what is a robot permitted to carry? When and where can it carry whatever it's carrying, and for whom? Who has access to the technology, and so on? Thinking about what it carries, like it's carrying some random product that's delivered as part of a global product system, perhaps shipped halfway across the planet. And even thinking about the end of life for ships that are involved in the global shipping trade. Like, some of these ships end up in Chittagong, broken down by, in some cases, children working by hand to do that work. So, like, this idea of cost savings, I think, really needs some exploration from the local to the global scale. The other thing I wanted to say was, I really appreciate and value the work that David Leposky has done to slow this conversation down, to have some sensible conversation about robots, the public realm, disability, and so on and so forth. One thing I'm concerned about, though, is that, media reporting on this and so on, there's kind of a totalizing or universalization of what disability is, right? So, I think we need to think about the need to have conversations with disabled persons about this sort of technology, right? To take up and acknowledge and honor the diversity that exists within the disability community. And to borrow on sort of social model of disability thinking, what we don't want at the end of the day is for the influx of robots into the public realm to become a disabling feature of our cities. And I think I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ron, and to share your viewpoints with us. And we also see that we already have some very interesting questions that raised by the audience. I apologize up front that I try to go through all the questions that with a limited time, so I may not be able to ask all the questions on behalf of you. And for the sake of time, I probably will combine some of the questions together. And if that's okay. So the first question, I'm just quickly flip through the chat box, and this is from Burn Grush, and perhaps I will. The question is, I think it's a very interesting, is that maybe we're talking about the very wide spectrum of general applications, opportunities, and concerns, and so on and so forth. But I think Burn's question is that perhaps that we can looking at if we look at the scope, would you say, the question is as follows, so that do you see this introduction of delivery robots is more like the introduction of e-scooters, or is more like the introduction of robot taxis, as well as a tax, or such as like a freights that Matt has mentioned. So with that, perhaps I'll go around the table. Maybe we'll start with Shauna. And maybe 1 minute also, and then we ask Matt from technical readiness perspective, and then we ask Ron to address from the user perspective. Shauna?
Sure, thank you, and thank you, Bern, both for joining and for this question. I know you are doing work on standards for, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but standards for autonomous robot delivery devices on sidewalks. I think that the answer is it's the introduction of delivery robots is actually a mix of the introduction of e-scooters and robo-taxis. And I mean, it's similar to e-scooters in the sense that we are seeing firms deploy these devices in cities without regulation. They're going in kind of very boldly, putting them on the sidewalks in some cases, and then seeing what the response is. And we saw the same thing with these scooters. They're kind of pushing to say, for municipalities especially, to say you are allowed, you're not allowed, you're allowed this many, etc. At the same time, some of these delivery robots are actually operating on streets and not on sidewalks. I think it's in Pennsylvania, where the state passed legislation that allows these robots to go both on streets and on sidewalks. And so here we have, and the speeds are actually relatively high. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's much faster than an individual could walk. It's also more like, it's more like robotaxis in the sense that it is being regulated as a type of a vehicle, where an e-scooter, I guess, it's also like a type of vehicle, but it's not necessarily running autonomously. So I just want to say, I think it's really a mix.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add into that. I mean, they're being treated, sidewalk robots are being treated differently in different jurisdictions. There's places where there's no regulation whatsoever, and others where they're banned. And there are, I think a mix of regulatory frameworks in between. So I wouldn't say there's a one size fits all approach to regulating robots.
So Matt, just follow up on this particular question, that from your current laboratory work and the research, what do you think that from technological readiness, that which one do you feel this is a little bit getting closer to reality?
Yeah, well, I can't speak to robo-taxis because I haven't really followed that system. But our initial results doing some very preliminary simulations is that there's going to be situations in crowded environments where the robots are just going to stop operating, and they have to be conservative, and they, for safety reasons, they're not going to plow through people. and they haven't quite got the negotiating skills in a crowded pedestrian environment to sort of make way in the way that we do as humans walk through a crowded pedestrian environment. But it's really early days for us in that research. So I don't have answers yet, but that's what I anticipate is going to happen. So I see that these really crowded places are not going to be appropriate, and there will have to be other solutions that make much more sense.
Yeah, I think the same question goes to Ron, that I understand you don't want to see any robot on the street. But if we look at this possibility that we have taxi deliver the goods, or we have e-scooters or chairs that to help for the transportation, which one do you think is a little bit more tolerable, or from general public perception-wise, a little bit more acceptable?
But I don't actually know if I don't want to see robots on the street. I haven't really figured it out yet. Like I know that I don't really want to see the current generation, because they symbolically represent inaccessibility, right? So like I don't know who they're for. Like I don't have enough answers to the ethical questions that are raised to really be satisfied with like a massive rollout of the current technology. I mean, what I'm reminded because of this question of, I was at in DC, I think probably for a Transport Research Board meeting, and this is at the time when the e-scooters came out, and it was like a plague of locusts. The ones that were left wherever. Some of them were dead. Some of them were still alive. It was a total mess. And so and I'm not just talking aesthetically speaking. I'm like, what happens at the end of life, right? With the technology, the resources that go into it, so like disposal and all of this kind of stuff, is another thing that I'm sort of reflecting on. So I don't really have an answer to that question. I think I just have more questions. In terms of like the robust aspect of the technology, like I don't think any of it is there quite yet. And there are different ways that these things navigate and operate, right? Like some of them are fully using like they're autonomous vehicles. Other ones will have a backup operator. Some of them are just being fully driven by an operator, like a drone technology. And then I think one of us raised the issue around data governance, right? It's like these things are seeing our movement, seeing what we're doing. Who owns that information? Did we sign a consent form to give away our mobility data to the robots that are roaming around the city? I mean, there's just so many fascinating questions, really.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think that's exactly the purpose of a panel discussion like this, to our general audience, that we have an expert in the audience as well. But as you can tell, that even right now we don't have a solution, we don't have answers, but that's exactly what we're here for, is to draw the awareness, to look at the different aspects, and just so that we can trigger thoughts, we can trigger further discussion and the study for that. I do have another question from the audience. Perhaps I will combine this, and this is a question from Shoshana Sachs, as well as the follow-up question from Bern, is that combine this kind of a question together is, what do you think right now is how the tech industry and working on this reliability, robustly, whether they're working on now, and if not, when and and how, and specifically how this is the safety, for example, in the intersection has been addressed. Perhaps I'll start with Matt, and then we go around the table as well.
Yeah, my first statement is that the robot technology is working very well and very reliably in controlled settings like warehouses and places where they're not interacting with the mayhem of people in pedestrian environments. And I think that's the big challenge that the companies are grappling with is how do you deal with the unexpected situations. So yeah, they're working robustly and reliably in controlled, usually private settings for very specific tasks. But I think they're at least, and I can only really speak to the company that I work with, and they're tiptoeing into it. And at the moment, starting with accompanied robots that are just following a person. And with that, there are far fewer issues, I think, because they managed by the person that's accompanying the robot. As for the details of how intersection safety will be handled, I just don't have an answer to that yet.
What about you, Rob? What do you think that from a human perspective, what kind of safety features, what kind of and reliability features that you like to see? You think that this is a need to be addressed?
Well, again, it's like the stair climbing comment. I mean, there are stair climbing wheelchairs that don't work very well, and it can be pretty terrifying to use one, particularly if the stairs are steep and long and so on and so forth. And I think about, and this relates to actually a later question coming from one of our former students. So hi, Misha. Thinking about the ways in which this technology and the questions that it raises could have spillover effects to improving infrastructure for disabled people or pedestrians and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm concerned that we're not doing that anyway. It's taking robots and the commercialization of all of this stuff to finally get around to making cities work for everybody, right? That, I guess that's my so-called cross to bear, we know, for example, we just finished an article looking at motor vehicle injury and disabled persons, right? And what spawned my interest in that work was just noticing the height of my daughter in her power chair relative to parked cars. And as she approaches the intersection, what's the deal with visibility, right? So there are ways to make intersection visibility a little bit better in terms of the setback, how even further than currently allowed by bylaws in terms of where cars can park and so on and so forth. But I mean, these things are going to they're low to the ground by and large. Some of them aren't. And kind of a hazard for cyclists, not just drivers, right? And other folks. So I don't know how to get around the intersection safety thing. We're not even close to, talking about robust. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. So Shauna, based on your work that was Transport Canada, and so for the same question, where are we right now? What do you think? What is current the status, and what's the state of art?
Yes. So one of the things that we found is that the autonomous cargo delivery robots operating on sidewalks so far, none of them are operating entirely autonomously. The tiny mile ones were being actually driven remotely by an operator sitting in a warehouse somewhere, whether that was Toronto or somewhere else. And the Starship robots actually are described as semi-autonomous. They are autonomous about 90% of the time or something. And the other 10%, there is a person who can intervene, an engineer who's actually in their one of their engineering offices in Estonia, who can help manage. Now, for the most part, I would say this actually is relatively robust. It's not necessary, it's not 100%, but show me a form of mobility that's 100% robust that never has an incident. One of the issues is, though, that when a Starship robot goes the wrong way and falls into the river, or a Kiwi bot in Berkeley spontaneously lights on fire, who's there to put out the fire? It is a little bit funny, right? And at the same time, who's there to rescue this robot, to put out a fire, to make sure it doesn't cause a greater public harm? And again, I mean, it's not, I don't know that the numbers are worse. They're probably actually better than other forms of mobility in terms of, I don't know the right word to use, incidents, which is still probably not the right word. But they're not 100%. I don't think anything is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's the reality check that we're all facing right now. And we have many interesting questions that in the chat box. I apologize, I won't be able to read all of them one by one. So I'm also very aware of that. We have about 7 minutes left. So I'm going to combine and into this two big questions for the panelists to discuss. And so the first one is the infrastructure, so specifically that. If you can also link to the sidewalks and to the city of Toronto, that's where where most of us that will currently work and live, and perhaps that you can give your perspective on that. And if we have time, we also the second question will be that in terms of operation and how do we handle deployment, misuse, that kind of a scenario. So let's jump into the first one in terms of the infrastructure. Perhaps I'll start with the Ron this time.
Yeah, I think I sort of mentioned the sort of a response to the infrastructure piece in my last comment, but I think because of time, I'm just going to address the question about robots doing nefarious things on behalf of the client, right? And I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, who's going to police the robots and check what they're carrying? I have no idea. But it actually is one of the things I raised in my notes, which I didn't get to, is security risk. I'm not really talking about that. I also feel like it's kind of, I'm a little bit troubled just in general with like the fact that we're able to even have this conversation is sort of a reflection of the general like stability of where we happen to be living and working, which we're at this point where we can think about ordering a robot to bring us a hamburger. Like it just troubles me on so many levels. And I think I'll just conclude there.
Shauna, would you like to add your comment on that?
Yeah, yes. Well, I want to just follow on Ron's comment about being troubled by a robot bringing a hamburger. One of the things we learned in our work is actually that the reason why there is so much pressure for firms to deliver quickly is because firms have like Amazon, set the stage for people to expect that their goods could be delivered immediately. And so that actually has put all kinds of pressure on every delivery company to think about, how do I get this to people more quickly? If you read about drones, you'll be even more troubled. But I don't know that there's any difference between getting your hamburger delivered by a robot and getting it delivered by a person, which is, another area of work that I actually just started doing interviews on is with on-demand food delivery firms. And they have seen orders double and triple in the last year, in part because of COVID, the rise of contactless delivery. And one argument that they do make in terms of why we should support this kind of delivery is that actually it might reduce congestion on our roads if we have one driver delivering things to 10 people as opposed to 10 people going out to pick up their individual burgers or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Matt?
Maybe I'll first respond to Ron's comment about things in packages that we don't want, explosives and who knows what. I have trouble seeing the difference between our current delivery systems, where if the courier or the deliverer doesn't know what's in the package, then the same sorts of things could happen. I guess to me, there should be some responsibility of the delivery company to know what's in their robots. So that's just a reaction that I have. You know, there exists risks right now with our current system, and I guess there is some possibility that it could be exacerbated because there's no human that goes along with a package, and so there's no disincentive for the courier company to send a robot out. But also this idea of consumer expectations for fast deliveries. In the context of robots, yes, that's robots are one way to make that fast delivery happen. But the expectation of fast deliveries causes all sorts of unintended consequences. And, you know, greenhouse gas emissions, trucks being driven across the city with 3 packages in them, simply because they can't wait for a day to consolidate and do something that's much more efficient. And I think that that's one of the big environmental and congestion challenges associated with goods delivery in general. And I think this robot delivery is more addressing that symptoms of that larger problem.
Okay, thank you, Matt. We have only about 2 minutes, probably even less, and left. So instead of going through another question, I would like to invite our panelists that perhaps what is your final thought that for today's, if you want to build this a big sign in the city of Toronto, and what will be the main message you want to draw attention to general public, or if you have a final question to each other. And to want to trigger this one. So I would like to invite you to everyone to give your final thought on this one. At this point, I'm asking volunteer who wants to start. All right, Shauna,
I'll
please.
volunteer, and I'll go with the final. My final message would be, and this is something I wanted to say in my remarks but ran out of time. We need to think about the value of autonomous cargo delivery robots both from the perspective of what can and might they deliver and how might we facilitate this, and also from the perspective of encouraging innovation. I think we've seen this with other kinds of technologies, that what we think might be the cool use, the first use, is not actually the main value or the main benefit. That we might actually do all of this work on sidewalk delivery robots and learn something about how they operate or how they work, or how we develop policy to enable them that actually helps us down the road, or develop a new use for them, or understand something else better and create some, a new firm, a new opportunity, a new kind of public space. And I think that's where a lot of the value lies.
Thank you. Well said. Perhaps Matt?
Yeah, sure. I guess I think that coming back to one of Shauna's earlier remarks, that no policy is a policy, and a very restrictive policy also may have consequences that we don't want. And so I kind of think I'm really glad to see the group of people around the table, because I think that there is a role for the university to provide sort of evidence for what can be done, but also, try to be unbiased about impacts and what the real consequences are. But also to think forward about the legal, ethical, accessibility implications that we might not be thinking about when we, press our delivery button.
Thank you. Ron?
Yeah, I think Matt has really summed it up very nicely, and I'm grateful to have had this opportunity for this conversation. I suppose the only thing that comes to mind for me is the notion that the robots that we're talking about are relatively small things, but they require some big thinking to contend with. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you all for your to share your thoughts with us, and thank everyone in the audience. I don't know if Judy, or you're in the audience, would you like to say something to summarize today's discussion?
I can try to get through something. before things happen. Let's see if I can get through this. So thank you so much. What a great discussion. So many good questions. As Hugh said, we're here to ask good questions. So thanks to our panelists. Thanks to you for joining us, and hope we're going to see you again. I put all this information in the chat because I'm not going to try sharing my screen again. Here comes Pat. This is the 5th in a series of 7 sessions exploring the way forward. And maybe there'll be an 8th because we never run out of things to talk about. But we will be back in 2 weeks for designing complete communities, and once and maybe twice after that for discussions on important issues on mobility. Registration is open for these remaining sessions. You'll find information on the U-Tree website at utree.utoronto.ca. Mobility Network website coming soon. You get reminders if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter. We hope you will, which you can also do on the website. And you can always find out more by contacting us. Thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you once again to Hugh, Shauna, Ron, and Matt for pulling this all together. Take care, everybody. See you again in a couple of weeks, I hope. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.